this video, we'll be discussing the nature of metaphysics. What is the science of metaphysics? What would we be studying in a course on metaphysics? Before studying the science of metaphysics, it is important to be clear that the books contained in the metaphysics section at a bookstore today have nothing to do with the science of metaphysics as we intend it in this course. Metaphysics sections at bookstores contain unscientific books about occult self-help, magic, and other superstitious practices like astrology and tarot card reading. In this class, when we speak of metaphysics, we do not mean anything occult, superstitious, or magical. The science studied in this class has nothing to do with the pseudoscience written about in the metaphysics section at half-price books or Barnes & Noble. Rather, by metaphysics, we mean a general science having to do with the principles and causes presupposed by all other sciences, such as physics, biology, chemistry, geometry, arithmetic, and moral philosophy. If you are looking for metaphysics books as studied in this class, you'll have to find them in the philosophy or theology section at the local bookstore, not in the metaphysics section. The science of metaphysics was first practiced in an unscientific way by poets and then mathematicians in the ancient world. Let's look at some of the prominent early metaphysicians in the Greek-speaking world. The most important of these is Parmenides. He lived in southern Italy but was a Greek-speaking philosopher. He was in his prime around 475 BC. His student, Zeno of Elea, is also an important early metaphysician, or pre-Socratic metaphysician. He's the one from whom we derive the idea of Zeno's paradox. This is a paradox that is aimed to show that there's no such thing as motion. Zeno died around 430 BC. A third important early metaphysician is Pythagoras. He was an Ionian Greek-speaking philosopher who also lived in modern-day Italy. It's from his school that we derive knowledge of the Pythagorean theorem in geometry. He died around 495 BC. It was not until the Greek philosophers Plato, who lived 428 to 348 BC, and his student Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, who was himself the tutor of Alexander the Great, the emperor of Greece, that metaphysics began to be practiced in a scientific way. At the beginning, metaphysics resulted from asking increasingly general questions about things discovered in daily life, in history, in mathematics, and in natural science. People noticed, for example, that rocks fall towards the earth, without anything apparently moving them downwards. They noticed that flames of fire move upwards and that parts of the human body each seem to have their own purpose for the good of the whole body. Likewise, they noticed that one who is too hot or too cold dies, but someone at a middle temperature is healthy and survives. Moreover, in mathematics, it was noticed that triangles seem to be the strongest shape and that the longest side of a right-angle triangle always seems to have the same ratio to the other sides no matter what. Discoveries like these led people to ask more general questions about the universe, about causality, reason, definition, motion, chance, and purpose. Why do the parts of living things seem to have a purpose, but the parts of non-living things do not? Is this the result of a mere accident or chance? Why do the sides of a right triangle have the ratio that they have? Do we mean the same thing by why whenever we use the word? Or are there different sorts of answers given to the question why? Questions like these, drawing from what has been discovered in various natural, mathematical, and historical sciences, provoke wonder or curiosity, which eventually leads to the scientific study of metaphysics. Although Plato initiated the scientific study of metaphysics, his student Aristotle brought this science to a previously unknown level of perfection. Aristotle's greatest metaphysical work is the book now known as the Metaphysics. Aristotle himself never used the word metaphysics, instead referring to the science studied in his book as first philosophy or wisdom. Nevertheless, one of the later editors and catalogers of Aristotle's scientific works gave it the title Metaphysics from the Greek root meta and physis, meaning beyond or after natural science. Presumably, the editor intended by this title to indicate that metaphysics is the science that should be studied only after one has already studied the natural sciences like physics and biology. Aristotle's Metaphysics, although a single volume, is divided into 14 books, which themselves are subdivided into chapters. Although St. Thomas Aquinas lived almost 1,500 years after Aristotle, he is arguably Aristotle's greatest disciple. St. Thomas Aquinas, born in Roccasecca near Aquino in modern-day Italy, was first educated at the great Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino. As a teenager, he traveled to the University of Naples, where he first studied Aristotle's natural scientific works and metaphysics under his teacher Peter of Ireland. At Naples, St. Thomas joined the newly founded order of preachers, also called the Dominicans. He continued to study Aristotle in Paris and in Cologne, Germany, in part under the tutelage of St. Albert the Great, who at the time was the most famous Aristotelian and natural scientist in all of Europe. Eventually, Aquinas became a master of theology, equivalent to a modern-day doctor, at the University of Paris, and continued to teach Aristotelian metaphysics all over Europe, in Paris, in Rome, in the papal court, and in Naples. As St. Albert the Great would readily admit, St. Thomas far surpassed even the learning of his own mentor, Albert himself. Unlike Aristotle, St. Thomas never wrote a book called the Metaphysics, and most of St. Thomas's metaphysical thought is found scattered through the thousands of pages he wrote on sacred theology. The most important places to find St. Thomas's metaphysical thought are these. First of all, his early commentary on Peter Lombard's book, The Sentences, which is a commentary that consists of over 4,000 pages. This commentary was something that was expected of all students to make while they're trying to get their master's degree in theology. They had to write a commentary on the collection of quotations from the Church Fathers that had been compiled by Peter Lombard. A second important place to find St. Thomas's metaphysical thought is his short early treatise called On Being in Essence, or in Latin, De Ente et Essentia. This book was probably written by Aquinas in order to help his fellow students understand Aristotle's metaphysics. A third place to look for St. Thomas's metaphysical thought is his great disputed questions treatises, especially his disputed questions on truth and his disputed questions on the power of God. These were books that St. Thomas wrote as a master of theology, as based on his public disputations, which he was required to do as a master at the University of Paris. In these public disputations, students would take one side of an issue, and then other students would take another side of the issue, and then St. Thomas, as master, would settle the issue. Later, he edited these disputed questions into volumes called Disputed Questions on Truth and the Disputed Questions on the Power of God. A fourth place to look for St. Thomas's metaphysical thought is his greatest work, the Summa Theologiae. This is a massive three-part synthesis of every topic in theology. The parts of the Summa Theologiae are called the prima pars, meaning first part, and the secunda pars, second part, which is itself subdivided into the prima secundae, or first part of the second part, and secunda secundae, or second part of the second part. And finally, the tertia pars, or third part. The fifth place to look for Aquinas' metaphysical thought is his line-by-line commentary on the first 12 books of Aristotle's Metaphysics. This is a volume consisting of over 600 pages in the Latin edition. In this lecture, we'll take a look at St. Thomas's preface to his commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics. Our goal is to acquire a first familiarity with what metaphysics is and why it is necessary to study metaphysics. First, we will ask why metaphysics, also called wisdom, is necessary. Next, we will ask what wisdom is. That is, what is the nature of wisdom or metaphysics as a science? When many things are ordered to one thing, there must be something that orders them to that one end. But all human sciences and arts taken together are ordered towards human perfection or happiness. That's the reason why we engage in the various arts and sciences. For instance, a miner aims at achieving the goal of obtaining iron ore. The metallurgist is a more general scientist because he aims to refine the metal. So it's for his sake that the miner obtains iron ore. But the metallurgist is himself ordered or ruled by the car manufacturer, who's the one for the sake of which that the metallurgist refines the metal. The car manufacturer aims at the good of cars. But the car manufacturer himself is serving the ends of the business person. The business person is aiming at economic prosperity. This process cannot go on forever. Eventually we must come to some science that aims at living well in general or happiness in general, and this science will be the governor of all the other sciences. Since what each particular science or art is trying to achieve, the good it's trying to achieve, is for the sake of some more general art, which is trying to achieve some more ultimate good. Now, the science which governs all the rest will be the one that aims at the ultimate good, absolutely speaking. Now, there are two sciences of living well. First, there's moral philosophy, which is divided into ethics, domestic science, and politics. This aims at living well in external affairs and the life of virtue. On the other hand, there's the science of metaphysics, which aims at living well internally in the life of the mind. This is the contemplative life. Ultimately, everything in our external affairs is ordered towards the life of contemplation, which is the perfection of human life. Since external behavior and will follow the order determined by reason or intellect, the chief human science which orders all of the rest is metaphysics. Metaphysics is also called wisdom, or queen of the sciences, since it is the property of the wise man to put things into order. On the last slide, we saw that there is a need for some science called wisdom, which orders all the other sciences to the end of human happiness, just as the metallurgist is the one who orders the miner to obtain iron ore, so too wisdom orders all the other sciences towards its own end, namely of contemplating the highest objects. Now that we know wisdom exists, we must ask what wisdom is. What is the nature of wisdom? Aquinas answers this question by looking at the character of the good or wise ruler. After all, wisdom is the science that rules all of the other sciences. Now, a good ruler is the one who is most intelligent, the one who knows the purpose of the thing he rules and the mechanism by which what he rules works. Therefore, metaphysics, since it is the ruler of the other sciences, is the science that studies the most intelligible objects. But there are three ways in which an object can be considered the most intelligible object. First and foremost, from the order of knowing. Secondly, from comparison to sense knowledge. Thirdly, from what is proper to the intellect's own method of knowing. Let's look at the first of these ways, from the order of knowing. That from which we acquire certitude is the most intelligible object. But we acquire certitude of some fact when we know the cause that necessarily produces the fact. For example, we may believe the fact that we will fail a test, but not be certain because we don't know whether we have answered the questions incorrectly. But since answering questions incorrectly is what causes us to fail a test, once we do know that we have answered the questions incorrectly, then we can be certain that we have failed the test. So knowledge of causes is what gives us certainty. Therefore, wisdom is the science that studies the highest or most general causes. Now let's look at the second way in which wisdom is said to study the most intelligible object. Here, when we say something is most intelligible, we're looking at it from the perspective of a comparison to sense knowledge. The senses, such as the power of sight and touch, know individual things, that is, singulars, but the intellect knows universals, or common things. For example, we see this particular red triangle in front of our eyes, but our intellect knows the universal nature of redness and of triangularity. In other words, the intellect knows what it is for something to be red in general, or to be a triangle in general, whereas the senses only know this triangle and this red. But the most universal objects are things like being, one and many, actual and potential. Therefore, wisdom studies the most general or universal objects, like what being is, what it is for something to be one or many, and what actuality and potentiality are. Finally, let's look at the third reason that something is called the most intelligible object. Here, we're looking at something being the most intelligible object from the perspective of the intellect's own proper method of knowing. Since the sense powers know individuals, but the intellect knows universal natures, it is individual matter that makes things unknowable to the intellect, that is, unintelligible. Likewise, on the flip side, it is by abstracting common natures or ideas from matter that the intellect comes to know anything at all. It makes things intelligible by ignoring their individual material aspects. For instance, we know human nature by ignoring the individuating material aspects of Socrates and Plato, that is, individual humans. Therefore, wisdom, being the most intelligent science, is the science that studies things which by their nature are separate from matter, such as God and the angelic intelligences. Insofar as wisdom studies the highest or most general causes and principles, wisdom is called first philosophy. We don't study wisdom before the other sciences, such as physics and mathematics, in time. Rather, wisdom or metaphysics is studied last of all the sciences in the order of time. Nevertheless, wisdom is the first science or philosophy in the order of perfection and judgment, because the causes or principles it studies are presupposed in all of the other sciences. The subject studied by wisdom is the most universal object, things like being, unity, and multiplicity, actuality, and potentiality, as we saw in the last slide. In contrast, physics, also called natural science, studies a particular class of objects, namely material and mobile objects. Thus, since wisdom is more general than physics, it is said to be beyond physics, and it is named, therefore, metaphysics, or metaphysis, beyond a natural science. Finally, the subject of metaphysics, as we've seen, is being and other general natures. Nevertheless, since the highest causes of being in general are God and the angels, metaphysics studies these separate, that is, immaterial substances, in order to explain its proper subject, namely being in general. Accordingly, metaphysics or wisdom is also called theology, or divine science, since part of its investigation is the study of God, theos, and the angels. Although metaphysics is called theology, it should not be confused with sacred theology, which consists principally in the study of sacred scripture. To distinguish metaphysics, which is a natural human science, from the supernatural science of sacred theology, we call metaphysics natural theology. In sum, there are several words that we could use to define metaphysics, or describe metaphysics. The first is first philosophy. If we say first philosophy, just think of metaphysics. These two are the same thing, just different names for the same thing. Secondly, we call metaphysics metaphysics because it goes beyond, in generality, what physics studies. Finally, we can call metaphysics theology or divine science, or, if we want to be more precise, natural theology. That's because, as part of the investigation of metaphysics, we have to look into the nature and existence of God and the angels. All of these names designate one and the same science, namely the science of wisdom, the science that is possessed by the wise man. Metaphysics is not the same science as logic, but these two sciences are closely related. Without knowledge of logic and its method, one cannot do metaphysics well. Metaphysics, as we've seen, studies being in general. Logic, in contrast, studies being as apprehended in the mind. But since every being can be apprehended by the mind, logic is, like metaphysics, a general science. Both metaphysics and logic are general sciences because both study everything, that is, all beings. But whereas metaphysics studies being in general without any qualification, logic studies all beings insofar as they are known by the mind. Metaphysics looks outward at beings outside the mind, but logic reflects on the mind itself and its own cognition of being. Accordingly, some things we study in metaphysics properly belong to the science of logic, not metaphysics. Thus, it is important to say something briefly about the nature and division of the science of logic. Logic studies the operations or activities of reason or the intellect. But there are three activities of reason and, correspondingly, three parts of logic. The first operation of the intellect is called simple apprehension or knowledge of indivisibles. The verbal expression of this operation is found in names, words, or terms. For instance, dog, human, and Socrates are all words that signify the first operation of the intellect. The second operation of the intellect is also called judgment. The verbal expression of this operation is found in sentences, propositions, and enunciations, such as Socrates is a human. The third operation of the intellect is also called knowledge by reasoning, or simply reasoning. The verbal expression of reasoning is found in syllogisms, or arguments, or proofs, or demonstrations. An example of this is, if all mammals have hair, and dogs are mammals, then dogs have hair. This is a verbal expression of the process of reasoning, that is, the third operation of the intellect. Corresponding to these three operations of the intellect are the three parts of the science of logic. The first part of the science of logic, which studies the first operation of the intellect, in particular studying names or predicates, is the book The Categories. The book in which Aristotle studies the second operation of the intellect, or judgment, and its verbal expression, enunciations, is the book On Interpretation. In Latin, this is called De Interpretatione, or, according to the transliterated Greek title, Perihermeneios. The third part of logic studies the third operation of the intellect, namely reasoning. This part of logic is found in Aristotle's works, the Analytics. The Analytics are themselves divided into two parts, the prior analytics and the posterior analytics. The prior analytics studies syllogisms in general, that is, the verbal expression of reasoning in general. Syllogisms are basically just arguments, so when you take certain premises and reach a conclusion through those premises, that's a syllogism. The posterior analytics, unlike the prior analytics, doesn't study syllogisms in general, but rather a particular kind of syllogism, namely the scientific syllogism, which is also called a demonstration. So, syllogisms in general are just arguments where you reason from premises to a conclusion. But the scientific syllogism, which is also called a demonstration, is a syllogism where one reasons from necessary self-evident premises to a necessary conclusion. This gives you scientific knowledge, that is, knowledge which is certain and based on causes. So there are three parts to logic. There's the part studied in the book The Categories, written by Aristotle. There's the part studied on interpretation, and then there's the part studied in the two books, the Analytics. The Categories studies the first operation of the intellect, or names, On interpretation studies the second operation of the intellect, or propositions or enunciations, and the analytics studies the third operation of the intellect, that is, syllogisms, and in particular, scientific syllogisms, which are also called demonstrations.